Well, I had a minute this morning. I just wanted to share some more thoughts around this topic of anger, which is gaining some traction in different online spaces, but in particular over at the Net, which is a weekly conversational hub, which is hosted by OG Rose. The point that I wanted to start to bring in is that as you start to dig into anger, what you will usually come up against is that there is an even deeper difficulty or challenge with the related emotion of guilt. If we think about anger and the action impulse of anger, which often involves something aggressive or an impulse to hurt another person, then you can see how guilt would become part of the mix, because to notice that within oneself often leads to guilt for many people. So in the case of anger, it's not so much the feelings, the sensations in the body that anger creates. It may not even be the cognitive labeling that goes hand in hand with it. It's not usually those components of the emotion of anger that can be most confronting for a person. It's actually that next step that notices, oh, and if I really tune into that internally, I can notice what my anger would want to do. Like, I notice what in its most primal form it is pushing me towards doing with my body. And that obviously can be very confronting when we have not had prior experience of noticing such things, talking about these things, normalizing that experience. And so failure to notice and acknowledge the action impulse that comes with anger, the sensation that you can notice in your body about what this primal circuitry would want to push your actions towards doing in that moment. Failure to clearly see that, or to have some relationship to that is not confused with acting that way in real life, or failure to separate out this idea of the action impulse that we can experience versus choice, true choice to act in a particular way. We can't choose the action impulse that comes with an emotion, but we can choose to either follow the lead of that action impulse or not. That kind of discernment requires a real slowing down and looking at what comes with the anger. And there's just a huge, in my opinion, global failure to do that sort of thing from childhood onwards. And what often happens as a result is that we get cut off from noticing the action impulse. And so if we sort of fast forward to becoming an adult after having a childhood of never learning that kind of thing, and so instead we don't even really notice the action impulse anymore. When something happens in day-to-day life that starts to elicit anger inside, this also tugs on the thread, or sort of pulls on the roots of this whole system that learned that it's not okay to become aware of this action impulse. It's not okay to notice the extent of the anger within. That's dangerous territory. And what helps to maintain that is that it also starts to pull on the guilt associated with noticing that what is happening inside right now is the activation of a circuitry that, if it were left unchecked and completely took over, would be capable of reaching out and being aggressive and causing harm, possibly to someone who I also dearly love. But regardless, even if you don't dearly love this other person, it's just that's something that is outside of my moral code. It's something I would never want to do to another person. But this circuitry is activated. And so that conflict inside, right, on some sort of subconscious, unconscious level, also pulls on the thread of guilt to notice that within me there is this impulse to reach out and hurt this other person in front of me, and the associated history of how I have related to that inside me since birth, essentially. How has that gone for me in the past? The point I'm trying to get to, and the part that I would like to bring into this evolving conversation about anger, is at some point, at least, getting to a place where we can also talk about guilt, because not always, but there are all sorts of ways that those two are playing off one another, especially in the unconscious or sort of out of our awareness realm that is going on inside our psyche, and how that influences our conscious experience of what we're feeling in the moment and our behavior in those moments, and the anxiety that floods us often in those moments. So there is an anxiety, obviously, that can come with the anger, which I've talked about before, but then there's also anxiety that comes with any situation that starts to really just pull on the threads that are associated with this guilt that has been repressed, stuffed down for a very, very long time. One other way of starting to think about how these two things might work together too, that I think is important to bring in, is for a very young child, noticing the impulse inside them to reach out and hurt their attachment figure when they get upset, when something happens that creates anger in the child, to notice the action impulse that would want to reach out and hurt their attachment figure, who they also dearly love and desperately need for survival. Noticing that action impulse, just the action impulse, we're not yet talking about anything that happens in reality, just noticing that circuitry that's almost pushing their limbs towards doing this hurtful action. That in and of itself can create immense guilt for a young child, because it's much harder for a very young child to have a clear distinction between the realm of noticing action impulse inside them versus acting for real out in the world. So they are much more inclined to confuse those two things, and they actually need our help, right? They need our help to assist in separating out those two realms. Or a very young child, if they are left alone with all of this, even if they didn't do anything, to even notice that, oh, there was a desire in me in that moment to hit my mum over the head, or to push my dad onto the road in front of the car that was driving past, or all these things that are actually part and parcel of what comes with anger. To even notice that inside them can be emotionally akin to doing those actions in real life. So a child, a very young child, but I mean all of us, but I think especially relevant here is a very young child does not know the difference between noticing that almost like imaginary vision and urge in their body to do this hurtful thing to their attachment figure, versus choosing to either actually do it or not do it in real life. They can't make that distinction. And so to even notice that flicker inside them, inside their body, comes with an immense feeling of guilt that then can also flood the child. That's really important to get clear on for all sorts of reasons. I mean, obviously, it's important to get clear on just from a theoretical perspective to help to start to unpick all of this for what it might mean for us in adulthood, but also from a parenting perspective, right? There's so much that's missing, I think, from the parenting space that is really relevant here. So starting to get clear that this starts very young for many people, and there's just a theoretical failure here, I think, around understanding what is happening at an emotional level for a young child when they start to encounter anger. I just want to jump in from the future for a second, because as I'm editing, I see I'm about to go on a tangent, but I didn't finish this point. So the point I wanted to get to here about the guilt, if we are considering a very young child who can't make that distinction about noticing an impulse inside them to act in a particular way versus enacting that for real. The bit that I want to get clear on, that I think will be useful to talk about, is that it's not just a relationship that we develop to anger here. It's a relationship we develop to this emotion of guilt, potentially very, very, very early on in our life, where we become flooded with anxiety as a result of situations that may elicit anger inside us, but because the eliciting of anger is also hand in hand eliciting a guilt, and that this guilt could be a very repressed young guilt that has never had a chance to be brought up into the light of day, to be experienced by the individual, to be confronted and understood and had some meaning wrapped around it, and a chance to process, if we put it in those terms. And so for many people, it's not just relationship to anger, but it's the interplay of relating to our anger and how we relate to guilt. When we are thinking about ways as adults that we can learn to be with our anger and relate to it in useful ways and connecting ways, my belief is that we need, and obviously based on thinkers other than myself, obviously based on, for me, the tradition of ISTDP, but, psychodynamic, psychoanalytic traditions, it's important that we also take into account how we are dealing with and making sense of guilt that comes often hand in hand with noticing, in particular, the component of the anger emotion that is the urge, the action impulse that comes with it. In its clear form, not when it is fused with anxiety, but in looking at the most distilled version of the action impulse of anger. I don't know that for many people you could separate one from the other. And so if we're going to have a conversation about how we contend with anger, then we need to consider very closely how we contend with guilt. And this can also, in a therapeutic setting at least, lead to a confrontation with very early learnings about the capacity inside of us to act in ways that may be out of line with our moral code, or that may be destructive or may damage relationships. And so just like anger, guilt has what we could call a healthy form and an unhealthy form, and guilt has a anxiety that often comes with it for most people, many people, and guilt therefore has a whole range of defensive behaviors that stem from the anxiety that is elicited by the guilt rising into the preconscious. So just like with anger, just like with any feeling, it is often the case that people don't even experience consciously. They're not consciously aware of guilt in particular situations. They don't feel it. They don't think it's relevant to their experience in the moment. And yet they could be anxious. They could be acting in all sorts of other defensive ways. They could be having defensive emotions, emotions that are obscuring their ability to be consciously in contact with the guilt. I'm not entirely sure how this becomes relevant to the philosophical consideration of anger outside of a therapy room context, but I do think it's worth noting that our difficult and often gnarled relationship to the emotion of anger is not an isolated example of that, and that for many people, what sits even deeper than that is a knotted relationship to guilt. But I just wanted to throw this into the mix. And now I will go back to the earlier video. a couple of key points here, I guess, that I've made. There is a relationship here between anger and guilt that I think we can't get out of. Guilt can often sit at the deeper end of the root here. Once we get past challenges with anger, what we can often find is that these are being informed by challenges with guilt, and that this distinction between action impulse, noticing the push in our body, what our body wants to do in its most primal manner, in the moments when we connect to anger or guilt, can and is confused with real world action, how that and why that might start very, very young, and the manner in which this can create a lifetime of being cut off from circuitry within us that actually, if we have clearer access to, we are able to contend with in a mature, moral, adult, connecting, loving fashion. But we do ourselves a disservice if our psyche treats us with kid gloves. If it believes that it's too much for us to handle, we shouldn't look there, we shouldn't go there. And so all of this gets pushed underground. But we are capable, we are so capable of being able to have access to the full extent of that emotional circuitry. And with work, whether that be therapy or whatever it is, we are able, through having a more simplified, clearer, cleaner access to the full extent of that emotional circuitry inside ourselves, we are in a roundabout way more able to bring into the realm of real world action a truer reflection of what matters most to us. Then we really can make a distinction between the primal circuits that get evoked inside and what they want for us. We can then build on that to bring in these other key components of who we are in the world and who we want to be in the world, but only by first having clear access to those initial circuits. Then we have the space to continuously show ourselves over and over again every day that we are more than just the urges that arise in the moment, and that we are able to choose to act in nuanced, complex ways. So those are my thoughts for now on introducing a little around guilt into the conversation that is evolving about anger, both here on my channel somewhat, and also over at the net, which is hosted by OG Rose, which if you're interested, I really highly recommend OG Rose's YouTube channel. Anyway, my time is up. I hope there has been something of interest in there. Thanks for hanging out with me.